Welcome to the Make or Break Society. In this one, I'm going to be showing you how to make a ESP32 carrier board so you can use the Wi-Fi Marauder. This one's only going to use the ESP32, but we'll be leaving a lot of space here so you can use other cards as well. You'll be able to wire them in as well. I do use custom firmware on my flipper. So I know with regular firmware, I'm pretty sure with regular firmware, you can't write the Marauder firmware to this guy. So you'll probably need custom firmware, or you need to flash it on a PC. I won't be going over that in this video. With that out of the way, let's get started. For this one, you're going to need your Flipper 0, a soldering iron, some solder, some GPIO pins. If you're making it so your ESP is removable, you're going to need some male-female pins. You're also going to need your ESP32. In this case, this is an ESP32 S3 Mini from Waveshare, I believe. Yes, from Waveshare, but honestly, any ESP32 will work. ESP32 S3 Mini, like these 9-pin ones, or 18-pin ones, will be specifically talked about here, but the hookup is exactly the same for any other ESP32. You need some perf board. If you're going to make it like a plug-in module like I am, you'll need it to be at least 24 pins, but I went with 10 just to give me a little bit of room on each side for wiring. And then you may need some rub alcohol to clean up all your pins after. It's not really required, but it's nice to have if you want to pretty it up after. Okay, so let's get into it. Forgot to mention, you might also want a breadboard. Breadboard isn't really required again, it's just going to make soldering to this a whole lot easier because we'll use the breadboard to hold our pins in place. Okay, now let's get into it. Now, if you're using all the exact same stuff as me, what you're going to first want to do is break down these into sections. You're going to need 2 9-pin sections, as well as 1 8-pin and 1 10-pin section for the Flipper 0. So I've already got them pre-broken down. Here's our 2 9-pin sections, as well as our 8 and our 10-pin. Same thing with this. If you're not soldering directly down, the ESP directly down, you want to make it so it's removable and you can use it in other projects. You'll need to cut this down to 9-pin sections as well. I've got those pre-cut here as well. So the first thing you're going to want to do is solder up your Flipper 0 pins. So the Flipper 0 has 8 pins on the left side of the LCD and 10 pins on the right. So we're going to put our 10-pin section here, and all the way on the other side of this 24-pin board we put the 8-pin section. If your board is longer, like if you've got a 26-pin board, you put it on pins 1 and 24. Leave the other ones bare. You need this much space. You need 6 holes in between for the Flipper 0's GPIO. And then I'm also going to stick a couple of these on the other side. We're not soldering these ones in. This is just so when we go to solder, it sits flat. So I'll put those ones in after. So I'm going to punch these into a breadboard. so. And then on the other side, and just push these in a spot here. Basically, we're just, that way this sits flat and nice and stable for when we're soldering. Alright, so now we solder in these pins. I start with the outsidemost pin on each section. Now with those pins in, we'll just solder the rest of the pins down. There's our pins down. And like I said, we don't solder these ones in. Now we're going to solder pins into our ESP. Same deal. We're going to put these guys in the holes. Leave your long sides out. That was actually the same on this one, to leave your long sides out, I forgot to mention. And we push this into the board again, stabilize it down. Same deal, solder one of each side and then fill in. All of our pins on that look good. Okay, so now our next step, I'm going to push these boards, or these female headers, onto our ESP. They're clipped in like that, and then we solder them to this board. So I like to leave, and this is part of the reason why I use the size of board that I do. I like to leave one hole's gap on that side, and one hole's gap on that side to make running our wires a little bit easier. I'm also setting it as far to the right side of the board as I can, making the USB port a little bit easier to access. Not that we really need it for this project, but you may in the future, as well as to leave as much of this board open as possible in case we want to add like a GPS module or any number of other things on the rest of this board. There are no really great tricks for making sure all these pins are lined up. You flip it over and find something to keep the other side of the board up a little bit. So what I'll do is I'm going to solder the pins on this side in first, and then push it down to make sure it's nice and flat, and then I'll solder in the other side of the pins. There we go. And that's our ESP carrier. Next up is the wiring. We only need 4 wires. So we will need a 3.3 volt. We're going to need ground, and then we need TX and RX. I'll throw up on the screen here. We've got 3.3 volt, ground, TX and RX on the Flipper Zero as well. Most importantly, the TX and RX are swapped. So we solder TX on the ESP to RX on the Flipper, and RX on the ESP to TX on the Flipper. Ground and 3 volt are just soldered straight across. So I'm going to mark these pins with a marker, just so at a glance I can see which one's which, and I don't have to keep referencing. But the way these pins work is we have 3.3 volt, skip 1, ground, skip 1, TX, and RX. So we're going to do that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. So those are the pins we need. And on the ESP, if my camera will focus, so you can see we have TX and RX, these first two pins here. Come on. There we go. So these first two pins here, TX and RX. And on the other side here, we've got first pin is 5 volt, and then we've got ground as our second pin, and 3.3 is our third pin. So we're going to be using our second and third pins here, and our first and second pins here. TX and RX. So I'm going to mark that on our green board as well. I'm going to mark that on the other side because that's where we're going to do most of our soldering. So on this one, first two pins are TX and RX. So that gives it these two pins, TX and RX. Little black dots there. And on this side, it's skip 1, ground, and 3.3. Skip 1, ground, and 3.3. Like that. Yes, I will still, I'm just using black dots. Obviously, I'm still going to have to look at which one's which. That tells me that I'm only dealing with those 4 pins. Same thing up here, I'm only dealing with those 4 pins. So the way I'm going to do it is power and ground are going to come from this side around to these pins. TX and RX are going to come from this side around to these pins. So I start from the furthest away from my side first, so this one will come first on the case of this side. So this is our ground pin. I'll use our solid brown for ground. So white will be for our power. So this one's our power. And we'll use the solid brown for ground. So I want to strip one side of it. I'm only going to strip the one side. So pin 2 on this board is our ground, second pin in. It's not pin 2, it's something else, but second pin in, which is this one here. So I'm going to take this guy off for easier wiring. Second pin in is this one. So what I'm going to do, and this is part of the reason I use Ethernet cable wire for it, I'm going to push this through the hole so it comes out the other side. I'm going to tin the end of it. I'm going to pull it down till we're basically in line with that pin, so right there. And I'm going to push it over at approximately a 90-degree angle. I'm on focus. So you can see those two are touching there. And then, because I tinned it, I'm just going to heat it up. Yeah, now it's making a connection. Now we move to our next one. So I'm going to push this. Push that so it sits at a 90-degree on this side. And then I'm going to pull it over around here. I'm going to use a little bit of force here so it tightly goes around this corner. Like that. And I'm going to pull it up to our pin here. Just kind of curl it around. Just going to curl it around that pin. Gives me a nice place to cut. So on that curl, I'm going to cut just a little bit into the curl. So it lays nice and flat. And I should strip it. But another nice thing about Ethernet is you don't really need to. Set that in there so I'm not constantly worried about holding it around. Get it around our pin. Now the reason I say you don't really need to is Ethernet cable, most of it anyways, will kind of melt its collar back when you hit it with heat. It doesn't melt very far back, but far enough for what we're doing. Alright. That's our ground wire. And we're going to do the 3.3, exact same as before. So let's take a close look at the board now. You can see we've got our 3.3, our white one, soldered up, our ground soldered up. On the other side of the board, 3.3 and ground. Now let's move to TX and RX. Now if you remember, I said the order is TX first here and RX second. And on the ESP, it's also TX first and RX second. But because of the way I'm orientating this, I'm just going to set this in a weird spot here. Because of the way I'm orientating this, TX is this pin here, which is actually RX for this pin here. So when we put it in the board properly, the way it's supposed to go, RX, which is the second pin in here, so the farthest pin left, goes to the farthest pin left, which is TX on the flipper. So we're going from this pin to this pin, and this pin to this pin. Just remember, TX to RX, RX to TX. We're going to use green for RX on this. So that way we know the green is RX for this, orange is TX for this. See, this one got a little too hot and we melted the shield in a little bit on it, so I just have to be very careful with the next one. Okay. So that green one's kind of a mess, but so long as it doesn't touch anything else, it'll be okay. So we've got our ground, our 3.3, our RX, and our TX. Nope, sorry, TX and RX. And it's TX, RX. So we've got RX to TX and TX to RX. And that's it. Just those 4 wires. So now let's slap it onto our Flipper 0 and we can program and test it. Alright, so I've zoomed way in here so we can get this show up on screen. I could use the USB at the remote mode, but I want to be able to show the two together. First thing we're going to want to do is plug this guy into our GPIO. Depending on your board, your lights might light up or they might not. This has a previous firmware on it for something else. And though that firmware had no power indicator or anything like that lights, I think the Marauder firmware also doesn't have any of that. So we're going to go in, we're going to go apps, GPIO, ESP, and we want ESP flasher, and quick flash, and this is other ESP32S3. We click on that, we want to give it the Marauder firmware, and it's going to say, oh, that's a new one. And it's saying that it's not in flashing mode. The U's are new for me. So all we do at this point, we leave it here. And for this board, we hold the leftmost button and try and get both this, and then we just tap the right one. Okay, now it says waiting for download. Now it's just going to sit here waiting for download forever. So we back out, go back in, and then it grabs it and it'll start doing it. There we go. Please reset the board manually if it doesn't auto reset. So to reset the board manually, unplug, plug it back in. Still we got no lights on it because again I don't think this firmware has them. And now we can back out ESP flasher. Oops. And then we can go to, oh, missed it, Wi-Fi Marauder. And do a scan. Go back, and then we can list. So these are the ones it picked up. Now I'm not going to show you how to do anything with these, because that's A, beyond the scope of this video, and if you don't own the access point, it's very illegal. In Wi-Fi Marauder, you have a bunch of different types of attacks that you can run. Or is it this one? Rickroll's kind of fun. Somebody's like, "Hey, what's your Wi-Fi network?" And I want to connect. You run the Rickroll, and it makes SSIDs from never going to give you up. So this is like the first SSID is never going to give you up, never going to let you down, never going to break your heart or desert you. I think that's the way it goes. Rickroll's one of my favorite ones to hear for just fun, but you have the ability to war drive. You can't war drive with just this. You need a GPS module. That's one of the reasons there's more room on here. And this board only does 2.4 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi, not 5G. There are modules you can get. Again, they'll go here. There are modules you can get that'll do the 2.5, or the 2.5, the 5G. And I assume there's modules out there for 6, 6E, and 7. And if not, there will be. Yeah, that's it. I hope you liked this video. If you did, consider leaving it a like, and subscribe if you're new here. Anyways, until next time, remember, it doesn't matter if you make a break, as long as you're having fun.